let's go through what's necessary in a lab report. So you've been given this handout in class, but basically there's a few things I want to point out. And then if you have extra questions, of course, you can ask and post a question. So basically when you start with your lab report, use the template that was provided in class. That's just a guideline, but it's a good starting guideline. So you're welcome to download that template from Google Drive or from Edmodo and edit it as you like. You can go ahead and type. So far you've been writing your lab by hand, but that's just so you can work out a rough draft. So every experiment has to start with an aim, and so your aim right here has to have the independent variable and the dependent variable, and you should try to include the units. So if you're talking about length, if you're talking about the length of the wings, then you must include centimeters, or however you're measuring, centimeters or millimeters. And if the dependent variable is how long it takes for it to fall, well, that's going to be timed in seconds. If it's any other kind of experiment, you always have to include the units. It could be mass. We've talked about some examples of units. Here's an example for you to take a look at. The hypothesis is something that's very important. It explains what you think will happen in your experiment. You can try to make predictions about various patterns. You can say, I predict that as then you can name the independent variable increases or decreases, I expect the dependent variable to increase or decrease. And then you also have to try to explain why. You can do a little bit of background research here to talk about what could be the reason for that. So think about that. The variables are very, very important. So when you're working with the variables, what's happened here? Ignore that line. When you're working with the variables, it's good to set it up using a table, just like we saw in the template. So you list one independent variable and one dependent variable. And with fair testing, you explain basically what you exactly are going to change. So what does this mean? And then give some explanation there. Same thing with the dependent. The most important here is listing all your controlled variables. I recommend aiming for 5. Aiming for 5 controlled variables. So dropping height is one, and explain how you are going to actually do this. How are you going to keep that fair? Were there other issues that you encountered, or other issues that you should have planned for controlled variables? Is air a problem? Is the person who's dropping it the problem? Is the method, how about the method of how you're actually going to drop it? Think about that. List 5 and explain in detail how you plan to control each of those. Apparatus is a fancy word for the things that you're going to use. List the materials and then tell how many you have, how many of each item you plan to use as well. For the diagram, well, you have to try and draw a diagram. Now for this, we don't need any fancy shading or anything like that. So just using the rotor motor as an example, you don't need shading. It doesn't have to be 3D. You don't have to draw people in there and everything like that. Try to do everything with simple diagrams and try to use a ruler. Try to use a ruler. Scientific drawings will practice, but you're going to try to use a ruler and just make everything very simple and straight. If you use a stopwatch, just draw a simple diagram of a stopwatch. It doesn't have to be anything super fancy. For method, you need to put step-by-step instructions of what you plan to do or what you did. Make sure they are clear. Be specific about the equipment, and you don't have to use I, we, or you. Just talk in the third person or write in the third person. You should be used to that from writing class. For the data, you should plan to have it in a table, and in this case, you could choose to use one larger table. It's always a good idea to try to plan this ahead of time while you're setting up your data. But what is the best way that you can organize your data? The key is here, just by looking at your data table, we should be able to tell what your experiment is. So there have to be headings, there have to be all of these things here, the units, a title. For the title, you can say something is just, you can be detailed. You can say table showing how dropping times change as we change the length of the wings. So again, you could have your independent variable and dependent variable in your table title. For For the data analysis, you want to include a graph. We'll talk about this. It's an easy way to remember what to include in a graph. Make sure scales are evenly numbered. A curve or a line of best fit. We talked about that in class. The x-axis is the independent variable, y-axis dependent variable. Include your units there. Give your graph a title, and the graph title can be similar to the data table title. Graph title could be something like graph showing how length of the wings affects the dropping time of the rotor motor. So it's okay to have a long title. Just make sure it's very clear what exactly is shown in your graph. Also, same thing, by looking at your graph, we should be able to know exactly what your experiment is about. Finally, we get to two of the most important parts of the lab report, and you can't do this unless you've actually drawn the graph and looked at your data and you know exactly what your hypothesis was in the beginning. Your conclusion, you need to describe what you found, compare your predictions with your observations. One thing that's missing here, refer back to your hypothesis. Refer back to hypothesis. Talk about if your hypothesis was supported or not based on the data. And here's an example to look at. This is a good place to use extra scientific knowledge that you've actually researched on the internet, but make sure to include references or bibliography. We'll talk about the correct way to do that. Finally, for the evaluation, this is one of the most difficult things to do. Use a table like this with these two headings: problems with the design of the experiment and suggestions for improvement. Identify any problems you had, talk about specific ways that you could fix those problems. Of course, discuss the benefit of conducting more trials. More trials will eliminate any errors that were present just from having lack of data. Discuss your controlled variables, talk about them, and then maybe there are other controlled variables you want to include, and basically put it in a table like that. That should be everything to get you started. Good luck with everything, and post questions if you have them.